Peterson may be kind of a hot button character, but I read We Who Wrestle with God recently, or finished it recently, and I wanted to cover it. Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we are covering, just as I said, We Who Wrestle with God by Jordan Peterson. And as I said, he's definitely a little bit more of a hot button character in the world today, but I have enjoyed historically a good bit of his insight, especially his psychological insight in accordance with philosophy and theology. That kind of realm that he tends to cover is something that I just kind of enjoyed being able to think about and kind of argue with to some degree. One of my favorite things whenever I'm watching or doing anything in association with this kind of content, I like to think about some of the things that I've read and come up to my own conclusions about it, kind of push back against the things that I might not agree with, or question why I agree with other things, just kind of having conversations with myself about the material that I'm consuming. And the way that Jordan Peterson covers these kinds of topics is a way that I found very engaging and stimulating for myself intellectually. I know not everybody's a fan of the way that he kind of, I guess, speaks and how he formates his intellectual ideas, but it is something that, like I said, I tend to really enjoy. There are degrees to which a lot of his work just kind of resonates with my general thought process, and so that's why I enjoy his work. As a result of enjoying his work, and particularly, like I said, that realm of kind of psychological mixed with the theological and or philosophical that I enjoy, that made me really excited about We Who Wrestle with God when I discovered that it was a thing that existed. I had pre-ordered it and expected to get to it pretty soon, and I more or less did. I got it right on time. I started reading it in December last year. It came out in November, so it was pretty soon thereafter, and continued reading it through January of this year, but then I had several months of life where I was busy with other things and then was just straight up too busy, period, to be able to make time for this the way that I wanted to. And it took, I believe, until very late June, very early July for me to get around to finishing this, and I plowed through the rest of it in no time at all. I want to say maybe only a week or something like that to get through the last 2/3 of the book. And it was definitely an experience. The psychotheological angle I really enjoy as a dedicated thought experiment for this kind of worked for me. Being able to explore Peterson's thesis on why religious stories matter was something that I was looking forward to, and getting to explore that was really enjoyable mostly over this year, the little bits that I read over this year, and then getting a different perspective on kind of the standard biblical concepts, just kind of generally the way that Peterson covers things. Everything about this book seemed tailored to what I want with nonfiction kind of at this point in my life, and generally speaking, I was exactly right. So let's kind of move into the good and talk a little bit more about what I actually enjoyed about this book specifically. I'm not going to get into too much detail because it'll kind of bog things down in ways that I don't feel like I really need to, but Peterson's entire thesis with We Who Wrestle with God is something that I really resonated with. The kind of something that I just mentioned a minute ago. Religious stories are important, even if you don't believe them. That's kind of the point that Peterson is making, and he seeks to explore several of those biblical stories, some of those religious stories, some of the very foundations of what kind of religion means in the Western world, the Western tradition anyway, taking some of those ideas and explaining how they are psychologically relevant to people today. Like I said, even if they don't believe those stories to be true, is something that is fascinating to me. Whether you think they actually happened, whether you are a religious person yourself, these kinds of things don't really matter in the discussion of this book, because there is such a thing as inherent truth that exists even if something is not factually or historically accurate, right? So the truth is that biblical stories contain psychological truth. There is aspects of the human condition that are kind of inherent to a lot of those biblical stories, so whether or not they actually happened doesn't really matter so much as Peterson the thesis saying that there are certain aspects of the psychology of the human condition that exist within those, and understanding those and being able to apply some of that understanding to your life is arguably just as important as the story in and of itself is. The truth is that the truth about the nature of humanity is contained within the Bible and basically any other religious book as well that makes them important whether or not you believe in them. Another thing that I really enjoyed about We Who Wrestle with God is the structure, broadly speaking, being super digestible. It's split up into an sort of introductory piece called Foreshadowing, which contains the entire thesis of the book, and then it has 9 parts, where part 1 covers the creation myth of Christianity, part 2 covers Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden a little bit more broadly, part 3 covers Cain and Abel and the importance of self-sacrifice in kind of societal structures, and generally kind of on a more personal level as well. Part 4 covers Noah. Part 5 covers the Tower of Babel. Part 6 covers Abraham, Sarai, and Jacob, or Abraham, Sarah, and Israel. And then parts 7 and 8 cover Moses, where part 7 covers Moses as far as like Egypt and the freeing of the Israelites from Egypt. And then part 8 covers the wandering 40 years in the wilderness up until the promised land. And then part 9 skips a little bit of time and jumps to Jonah and covers a little bit of Jonah. And then the conclusion happens after that, where the thesis is reviewed with kind of a summary of all 9 of those parts. I found this structure to be really engaging and digestible and generally quite good. And I guess kind of as a more broad, like, what did I like about We Who Wrestle with God? My favorite parts of We Who Wrestle with God were just incredibly insightful and engaging for me intellectually. They were just really good. So parts 3, 6, and 8 were my favorite parts overall. Each of those I found to be incredible. Again, part 3 was about Cain and Abel and kind of the importance of self-sacrifice for a greater good, especially for those that you care about. A lot of those ideas, concepts, and I guess the covering of those just really, really resonated with me personally. Part 6 was the section about Abraham and Sarah and Jacob, those characters of the story that I also found to be really, really engaging, particularly insofar as like a change in identity and name is concerned, because of course Abraham became Abraham, Sarai became Sarah, and Jacob became Israel, and all 3 of those had their names changed when they reached important sections of their life, when they encountered something important and faced it head on and grew through it, through which God rewarded them with a name change. And the way that the kind of etymology and importance of the names themselves kind of matter in the biblical corpus is really interesting material. I really enjoyed all of that, to the degree that the fact that Peterson skipped over Joseph and then went to Moses for part 7 and 8 kind of disappointed me. That's how much I enjoyed part 6. I think part 6 might be my favorite of the book entirely. It's one that I might reread at some point in the nearest future, just to kind of like actually take notes on, or take more full notes on, I guess. I also, like I said, really enjoyed part 8, which was Moses part 2, kind of the wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years and up until coming to the promised land. The way that Moses as a character was covered in that section, and particularly how he was barred from the promised land and had to give over the status of prophet and leader for the Israelites over to Joshua, his brother. Was Joshua's brother? I might have that detail wrong. I apologize if so. But kind of that, and the dichotomy of Moses still being the prophet despite disappointing God in certain ways within that section was also just really enlightening. I enjoyed those parts a lot. Part 2 about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden also had some really good material. There was one particular sentence I can recall from part 2 that like so fully explained, like, again, in one sentence, perfectly my experience through high school, to a degree that it was just really disorienting to even read. It was like, how in the world did you like consolidate my entire high school experience into one sentence and put it on the page? Because it felt like that's what Peterson did, and that was really cool. The conclusion was also a very effective wrap-up, being able to take the right around 500 pages that We Who Wrestle with God is, and condensing that thesis and a brief summary of all of the parts down into 10 pages, make like a little essay of a conclusion here that is really, really effective. And especially having read all of it in full, being able to kind of see the ties together was really great. I enjoyed all of that quite a bit. But of course, not everything about We Who Wrestle with God was fantastic. There were some things that I didn't love quite as much. You know, I don't subscribe to the 1-star review bomb gobbledygook critiques that a lot of people are wont to put onto Peterson, just kind of in a silly way, I guess. You can also tell that a lot of people who make those kinds of critiques probably didn't read the book. For example, there's one Goodreads review of We Who Wrestle with God that was posted on the day that it released that said it was 25 hours of gobbledygook or nonsense or whatever. And like, this person did not read the entire book and then review it that day and say that it was all nonsense. That was definitely a review bomb type of situation. But even in that case, like I said, I don't really subscribe to the kind of 1-star, like this entire book was absolute nonsense critique. But I do think there were some moments of the book that did fly a little bit over my head, where I went into this, every time I read it, I expected to have to think a little bit more critically and have to work through Peterson's speech habits as well, which, you know, I'm not super unfamiliar with. Like, I've listened to him speak enough that I know how his speech patterns work. It's just that translating that speech into writing doesn't always make a one-to-one effective way to follow kind of his thought patterns. That meant that some things flew a little bit over my head. I thought that part 5 on the Tower of Babel was kind of just okay. For example, it had a weaker connection to the thesis that it was like, this is okay. You didn't really need to have the Tower of Babel in there. Like, it worked sort of, but again was a little bit weaker and more tangentially related rather than being an actual like really hard hitting point on the thesis. Part 7 also had some great stuff. It was the first part on Moses. I really enjoyed that, but there were some sections of part 7 that also just flew right over my head, where it was like, I don't even know what those 5 pages were even supposed to mean, and I would kind of go and skim over it again just to see if like there was like a particular detail in there somewhere that I missed. I would kind of help it come together, and sometimes I couldn't find the thing that made it come together. So there were some sections that were a little bit harder to put together. And there were also a couple of decisions that I kind of went over a little bit earlier that I'm not quite as happy with as far as the book is concerned. Part 9 on Jonah fits with the thesis in the end, but the jump following from the stuff in the Torah all the way up until Jonah is just a really weird one that doesn't feel right, even though it fits in with the thesis. That jump, that disconnect just feels wrong to me. I also mentioned how the jumping over over Joseph was just a really weird decision, because the Abraham section was so good, and Joseph's story in the Old Testament is maybe my favorite part of Genesis. Actually, it is my favorite part of Genesis, and arguably my favorite part of the Torah, broadly speaking. So jumping over that entire section just to get to Moses didn't really make sense to me, because I feel like there's a lot in Joseph's story that could have made for really great material for this thesis that I really wish had been explored. Like, if you cut out Tower of Babel, for example, and put in Joseph in here instead, like, you have a longer book, obviously, because Joseph would probably take a while to cover, but like, it would have been just so good. I really wish we had gotten some of that. There's also the fact that the next book, Peterson has already said, like, when this book came out, he said he had already written, upwards of like 80% of like a sequel, where that sequel is going to cover mostly New Testament / Gospels stuff, even though it would incorporate some Old Testament things, kind of like this incorporated a couple moments from the Gospels in it as well. It's one of those decisions that's just like, I know this book has to be finite, like, you can't just cover everything in just one book, but there's lots of ground that was missed in the Old Testament that I would really like to see in a follow-up, as opposed to just jumping straight to the Gospels, Obviously, I already covered the story of Joseph. Like, I really would have liked to see that. But even being able to see stuff about Samuel, especially David and Goliath, like David in general as a figure, but David and Goliath is a story that really could have been in this book as well. Solomon, of course, really could have been in here. I mean, there's the prophet Elijah is kind of tangential and mentioned in the introduction and thus the conclusion, and maybe in a couple sections throughout, like just a couple very particular sections. But there's also not anything about him really in the body of the book, which feels a little bit off. Of course, the stories of Daniel and Esther could apply as well, and I would have liked to see some content on that. It's just the fact of the matter that the Old Testament is absolutely huge, and I just wish there was more of it covered in this book, and I wish there was a follow-up that was going to be covering more of this stuff that I'm like, I want more of the Old Testament stuff. It was really enjoyable. I'm excited for the sequel, but I kind of missed some of these stories that I would have liked to see, say, like More Than Jonah, for example. And just one final point on the bad that I forgot to include in my notes, and therefore include in the original recording of this video, is some of the endnotes can be a little bit hit or miss in this book as well. There are times where Peterson just links to like Wikipedia articles on certain topics instead of a better resource, broadly speaking, where there are a couple occasions, don't get me wrong, where like that totally makes sense, where he literally includes in those endnotes saying all you need is a brief overview of this topic, and Wikipedia is good enough for brief overviews on some of those topics. But there are other times where having literally any better, more official, or rather professional, I guess, citation would be a little bit better and definitely preferable. So that's something that kind of bothered me at certain points, but not enough to break the experience of the whole book. As for the ugly, the main complaint with We Who Wrestle with God on more of a technical level is that the copy edit on this book is honestly kind of terrible, especially the further it goes, and the further it goes being an important point, because I think that's part of why certain later sections of the book get a little bit harder to parse in certain points in time, where sentences are a little bit less consistent in their structure, where there are certain like inherent typos that kind of confuse things a little bit. I definitely feel like the copy edit on this should have been a lot better than it was, especially considering this is Peterson. He's sold so many copies of like 12 Rules for Life, for example, and is such a well-known figure that there's really no excuse for a publisher to not have had a better copy edit on this book. There's also the fact that, kind of like I mentioned earlier, Peterson's speech structure and general way of talking about things is pretty complex and can sometimes be pretty hard to follow. So the way that things can get just weird with typos and it's just aggravating. I got pretty aggravated with particularly like the last third of this book, because the copy edit got to be really bad in some sections. It was like there are whole pages of this where like you can't even count on two hands how many little errors there are, noticeable errors as well. That's like this definitely needed a much sharper copy edit, and that's unfortunate. As far as a recommendation goes, though, I think that there is a case to be made for a lot of people reading this book, whether you're a fan of Peterson or not. I think that if you are curious about the intellectual side of theology, just kind of broadly speaking, I think that if you are interested in the psychological side of the foundational Old Testament stories, as this primarily covers, like where those stories could have come from and what the importance of them is, even if you don't believe in them. If you want to entertain a new perspective on some of the stories that you grew up with, say if you're a Christian already, or if you want a conceptual understanding of Christianity without some of the abject preaching that comes with it, if you're not a Christian already. And generally speaking, in all of these cases, or none of them, if you have a different motivation, if you are coming at the conversation in good faith, pun not intended, like genuinely speaking, if you're coming at the conversation in good faith, I really do recommend We Who Wrestle with God. Not everybody's going to love it. Not everybody's going to get much out of it. Not everything about it is phenomenal, but with the genuine interest, there's a lot of insight here for anybody who's looking for it, and I had a great time with this book. There are some of the more technical things that I was disappointed by, in a couple sections that I didn't love, but the portions that I really enjoyed were so worth reading that I don't have any questions about whether it was worth my time to read this book. I think it absolutely was, and I think, again, anybody who's coming at it in good faith will probably come out of it feeling a similar way. So that's the review. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you don't mind a little bit more of a random book being covered. I haven't really covered a lot of nonfiction. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've only covered one nonfiction book before, and even that was Endurance by Alfred Lansing. And like, that's, you know, it might as well be a fiction book. It's written so well. By written so well, I mean like it's so engaging. It's so enticing, like to read in that way. So this is a little bit different for my channel, but I do want to cover, you know, certain nonfiction books a little bit more often, not necessarily super often. I don't read very quickly, and so can't read very many books in a year, and I'm not going to read like several of these types of books in a year all of a sudden, but being able to read a book like this in the future and being able to continue covering some of them is something that I would like to do. I don't want to be incapable of covering something like this, just in terms of the statistics and the analytics, I guess, of the channel. But it was nice to be able to cover something different. It was nice to get this book off of my backlog, especially when I started it last year and then had several months there in the early portions of this year where I just didn't have time to get around to it. So it was nice to be able to get it done. I do plan on checking out Peterson's other books, but I'm not entirely sure when that's going to be. It's likely that whatever sequel to We Who Wrestle with God comes out, that will probably be out and like released by the time I'm actually circling around to reading Peterson again. But I do also want to check out the 12 Rules for Life books. I've been interested in those, and then Maps of Meaning especially seems like it would be really great with a certain amount of dedication and study going along with it. Plus there's the fact that he has his Maps of Meaning lectures that he did way back in the day several years ago. He also has a new version that I believe is coming out on Peterson Academy at some point, if it's not already out at this point. Being able to use either one or both of those for companion pieces to Maps of Meaning would be really cool. And speaking of Maps of Meaning as well, that is a book that Peterson cites in the bibliography for this book very often. It seems like We Who Wrestle with God kind of borrows from a lot of the foundational research that has already been done in that book, so I feel like that would also be worth reading for that reason. But either case, sorry, I keep getting off track here. Thank you one final time for watching. I hope you did enjoy the video. I will see you guys in whatever I post next. Next week it'll be a review of this little fantasy book here. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.